cEDH tournament coverage fails to highlight what cEDH offers as a format.
Pretty spicy take there. Can you elaborate for the audience?
No. If you enjoyed this video, like, comment, subscribe. Consider supporting me on Patreon. Thank you to big $10 patron LF Cruz. Everybody over there gets access to these videos early. You get a shout out in these videos. Same goes with the merch. Make sure to check out the Turbo shirt, Nagilo shirt, all the merch over there. You can see Eric rocking it right now. Link in the description. And with that being said, let's hop into it. I think when you get into high level cEDH, where all the players are really aware of what's happening, they have an understanding of who is leading, what are the advantages and disadvantages that each player is facing right now. The game isn't really about who gets to their combo first. Often that isn't that great. cEDH is really about the resource war that you fight. And that's why we keep talking about Rhystic, Mystic, Esper Sentinel. These are cards that tip the balance one way or another, because yeah, you can play around Rhystic, but you're lowering your mana resources by doing that, or you're giving them cards. And that push and pull of mana and cards, really what it ends up being is options that you're affording to either yourself or your opponent. That is the real game that's being played. The decisions that you make when an opponent has 2 cards in hand versus 7 cards in hand are completely different, I feel. Especially once Rhystic and Mystics start getting involved. When those triggers are hitting, Crom triggers, blah, blah, blah. That changes your evaluation of threat assessment, politics, because the options afforded to a player with 7 cards versus a player with 2 cards are wildly different. And you can't even see the card count in a tournament game of cEDH. You have no idea how many cards people have in hand. As a viewer, the resource war and politics element, which is the other big thing I think is a major part of cEDH, is the discussions that happen, the table talk, even the body language to an extent that happens at a table. Those are the things that are influencing decision making. The resource war, the politics. Those are both completely absent from current tournament coverage of cEDH.
I want to look at it as this isn't a way to, like, I'm not slamming anybody. Like, that's not my take at all. Like I said, we're kind of in this new part of cEDH, but I would take a look at other sports. There are other things that are really, really like player centric involved, and they do a lot of talking. I think there's simple solutions out there. Again, it could be staffing, it could be finance. It's looking for right casters. And if somebody goes, well, what do you know, how would you know, you're not a caster, blah, 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 blah. I'm just like, listen, explaining things to people is kind of part of my job. But in reality, if we're going to see cEDH grow from a viewer's perspective, there needs to be a little bit more professional approach to it. The 2 casters or the caster or whoever's in the booth, there shouldn't be anybody else like talking to them or yelling at them or whatever outside of like an emergency. There shouldn't be like randos walking by, dapping them up, whatever, and all this other stuff. Like you got to understand, like you're producing a product, and I get they're fairly new at this, but Magic coverage isn't new. The footprints are laid out for you. You just got to figure out and fine tune this. And they could literally be doing this, Monarch, whoever, they could literally be doing this as we speak. Yeah. And this rant looks very stupid. And I typically don't like to this grinds my gears, but I love Magic and I love watching Magic. When you watch the Pro Tour, oh my gosh, it has a certain feeling about it. You know what's going on. You see the cards in everybody's hand, the board states, all this other stuff. This does not really refer to online Magic. This refers to mostly in-person. This is in-person Magic that I'm referring to. I want that to be clear. But I believe it's very possible. And again, I'm sure they looked into it. And I'm sure these companies know if Monarch and all this are supposed to be making these massive impacts, then if Monarch comes in and they improve viewer coverage, that matters. Like when I see Croaky's streaming and he's got 3,000 viewers and there's this massive cEDH tournament with 100 viewers or whatever, that's a problem. If you didn't know any better, Twitter would tell you that thousands of people are upset about something on Twitter with a cEDH tournament. It's just the views don't convert to the talk on Twitter. I just think that we could have a cleaner, more effective approach, and there needs to be a more no-nonsense approach to it. There's this saying I have, the structure equals freedom. Once you have structure and you build a foundation of something, then you can really explore and kind of improvise and do types of things.
This was something that I didn't really think about for a while, but I would watch cEDH tournaments. I would check in, but never really get that much interest. The difference between top finals of a cEDH tournament and an episode of Playing with Power is that the guy narrating the Playing with Power episode actually knows what's happening. From the other perspective than that, you look at webcammers, like we talked about, improving webcam other than just commentary and basic tech solutions for making things look nicer, that's not really something you're going to be able to have a lot of control of because it's webcam magic. It's in people's houses. What are you going to do? In tournaments, though, it's a different story. And so I remember I would watch tournaments and just not get interested. And then I remember turning on this channel that does reruns of old Pro Tours and stuff like that, and watching Pro Tour Return to Ravnica drafting. Format I know nothing about. I don't know any of these players. I don't know any of it. But because I can see the players, because the commentary knows what's happening, because I know the cards in hand, because I can clearly see the board state, I am immediately way more invested in a format I know nothing about and people I don't know anything about than the format that I am most exposed to, make content about, and that have players that I know personally playing at it. I'm less invested there because the content isn't viewer focused. It's just, this is what we're recording. It's not a presentation. It isn't trying to make things super easy to follow, which I think is even more needed in cEDH than something like a draft environment in 1v1 Magic. Not having player cams, it makes it really hard to get invested in, and again, understand the political game and the resource game, because most of the time we cannot see the cards in hand for players. Player cam would be a big thing I'd want to see. And also when you look at, Eric mentioned, which I really liked, was like sports and other player focused games basically and their broadcasts. The thing that viewers care about are like storylines and personalities. You can't even really recognize who's at the table because it's just a pair of hands and a username that you might not even know. It's a lot harder to get invested than like, oh, that's the Tivit player that I saw earlier today. Immediately you have this connection because I can actually look at the player's face and recognize like, oh, I know them. They go to my local store. Being able to follow storylines and personalities is a huge part of viewer engagement across every single medium. When you remove the layers, when you just make it look like it's a webcam game and there are just hands floating playing cards, it just removes the spirit of the game, I think, to an extent. It's hard to care when that's all you're seeing. When you aren't seeing the people get flustered, when you can't hear when there's a heavy politics moment, which drives me insane. I get the need for good commentary or just a focus on commentary. There are moments when there's nothing happening other than player discussion, though. That doesn't need commentating on. There you should swap over. I've heard plenty of excuses for why. None of those are real. I think you have to stop being so obsessed with your own commentary and just say like, hey, this is a moment where the viewers at home cannot follow this if we don't shut up and play the player's audio. It's impossible. So let's just do that. That needs to be more of a thing, especially at the higher level. Yeah, sure, players might yell out something that you don't want to hear, you might get in trouble for. The community is not going to backlash against you because a player got upset and said something they shouldn't have. That's not realistically what's going to happen. More of a focus on what creates a good experience for viewership, and less, again, like Eric was saying, you don't want to come across unprofessional in your broadcasting because you're representing the community. And if you want the community to be taken seriously, you have to also be able to be taken seriously. When that includes like a bunch of in jokes and making fun of decks and references that people aren't going to understand, because you should probably assume that your viewership skews newer than experienced, because those are the people you want to be like watching, because you want someone to see cEDH content and say, wow, that looks cool. How do I get in? If they can't follow anything that you're saying because it's a bunch of in jokes, then what are we even doing here? Why are we pretending that this is an esports thing or a real broadcast of good content when it's just, we're basically just like trying to show off and look cool and feel important at that point? Like if the focus isn't on making a good product and making that super accessible and every part of it look great, then I don't know why we're bothering.
It just feels like it's more self-serving than serving the community. And what I mean by the community, I mean, you really want to grow, especially if you're a business and you're trying to like grow this thing. Like if you want to be to the level of something like what SEG was or what Channel Fireball was, I'm not talking about your local game store streaming your cEDH tournament. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying like if you're going to be a major player in the Magic space, in the gaming space, then it has to be serving others, community serving instead of self-serving. If you do that and you take care of your viewer base, because let me ask you a question. Who watches the Pro Tour? The pros or the people trying to get to the Pro Tour? The people trying to get to the Pro Tour is watching the Pro Tour because the pros are already there. So that's your audience that you're catering to. Reed Duke's not going to go back and watch the Pro Tour and just be like, yeah, they really highlighted me like super well playing my mid-range deck. You know, that's not what Reed's concern is. Reed's concern is qualifying and playing on the next Pro Tour. You know, when you see players that you really enjoy, and this is something I want to connect, storyline. if we're doing this whole invitational thing for eminence, then let's have some player profiles of your leaderboard. Like, let's know about these players, like make them accessible, and not to initially like people can reach out and talk to them, but let's know who they are. I don't want to know who like Combat 99 is. I don't care about that name. I want to know who this is. If they want to go by that, that's fine, whatever. Have a storyline invest, like who's going for it, who has a shot to get in, what are your point systems, all this other stuff. Make it pretty accessible to know, because when you would get on like SEG, you could like, as soon as you're on the main landing page, you scroll over to the right and down, and there's the leaderboard. Todd Anderson right now, I know like it was Corey Bellmeister, Brad Nelson. You're invested in these people doing well and trying to qualify for that big final event. And then that's the exciting part. Is it going to be, instead of just like the Tivit player, you know, they could say, oh, my favorite deck is Tivit, but I also like metagame pick based on what I think is going to be good this weekend. You know, unless you're like super entrenched into a certain deck, maybe like Niv Mizzet, like Shauna or something like that. But that's exciting too. Like, isn't Shauna on like some like wild like streak of like top 16ing with Niv Mizzet lately?
She's been doing pretty well, yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And that's a cool storyline that we get to know, because we get to hear about Sean. Because if you're content related, or like if you do content or you're content related, those stories we hear about. We hear about Ian's flu game with coronavirus because Ian makes videos. We don't hear about random Mad Farm player, like, because then when you hear, it just becomes like, oh, well, who won the tournament? Rocco. It doesn't become who won the tournament, Kyle, whatever. It's always just like, did you do content? Are you a known person? It would benefit Eminence that people doing well in their tournament are known people. If you can turn them into known people that people care about and want to watch compete in your events, it only benefits everybody. It's all upside.
I think knowing the players that aren't content creators like would really benefit. And I think that's also comes from a position, because like Matt, you got a pretty sizable channel and for especially like cEDH, and you've got a solid audience. So you saying that isn't like self-serving. You're saying that like that it's different when you're like not somebody who wants to get exposed, but you're already, you know, fairly exposed. You have fairly good connections, blah, 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 blah. You know, you're saying, hey, there needs to be like more focus on these players that are doing really well in these events to help grow the event. Because again, no matter how much information's out there right now, it's still all scattered. It still feels super scattered, right? There's still not a central hub of this is Alana, this is Brian Koval, this is Shauna, this is, you know, X, Y, and Z person. There's just so much storyline. Like, I would find that fascinating. And that's just for me, because I always had my favorites in like 60 card formats. Like, I loved watching Pat Chapin. I loved watching Brian Kibler. I love watching Reed Duke. I want to watch Paper Magic. And I want to see the emotion, the passion behind it. And if you take that out of the game, then you're watering down the game. You really are. Then the game's not true. And I know people are scared about like a bad word being said or something like that and whatnot. But all that could be on camera too, like for the Pro Tour or whatever else. And we've seen people lose their cool like on there, and we've seen awkward deck checks and that type of stuff. And that's just part of the game. It's not an infallible game or infallible system. But that is part of what makes Magic magic, and whether it's the good or the bad, you know, that's part of it. So I just think having realism and an understanding of the humans that are involved, you know, cEDH may never be as big as these other formats, but as long as it has that commander built into with it, it always has the chance of like growing. And there's always going to be what happens, just hypothetically. We've talked about this. Star City Games goes, you know what? cEDH has really, really grown. Let's do a cEDH like SCG tour. How do you think that looks? Do you think that's popular? Especially too, if you're really trying to get competitive and they're putting like big prizes and stuff up, and coverage. That's the biggest thing is too, the coverage. This is just like my ramblings, my takes. I've watched Magic a long time, and this is just something that I would like to consume. I would love to be able to see what's going on, what the politicking like, what's their thought process, you know, those type of things. I think more player interviews like in between coverage is really important, because those are the players playing the deck. But just having like that kind of that clean transition, clean casting booth, that type of stuff, I just think that will really enhance the product. Versus right now, coverage feels very much like I don't want to say a boys club, because that's not the right word, but it feels like a good old boys club, if that makes any sense.
For the old heads here, it's like old FGC, old Melee coverage where it's just a bunch of friends hanging out and that spills into it. Like it feels more like that than it is like commentary that's like with a lot of camaraderie, but it doesn't become about them. It's always about what's happening through this lens of this great charisma and chemistry that the two commentators have together.
Yeah. And that's hard to find. And that takes time. And again, someone's going to be like, well, if you think you can do it, you could do a better job.
Put us on there. Heck, we'll be at the cookout. We can do some commentary. If we scrub out, before top 16, I'll commentate top 16.
Oh, I definitely plan on 03 and that event. No, I'll play all the way through. I don't care.
There will be a lot of responses, like Eric mentioned, like, oh, if you think it's so easy, you do it. Or just like, you guys are just trashing whatever, Eminence, Monarch, whatever. The goal of this, if this advice is taken and listened to, it isn't that I want the people listening to it who currently do this casting to come out of it thinking like, man, we really suck. We're really dropping the ball. We're trash. It should be that they hear this and say, these are things we could implement to be better. Let's do that. If you have a presumption of like what we're doing is good enough, you are just falling behind already. You're just ready to fall behind. Like Eric mentioned, if Star City Games got into it, there's no competition for anybody currently casting cEDH because they aren't at that level. And there's monetary concerns there where it's just, if you can spend more money, cool. But like, if you're not trying to one up yourself every event and really take this sort of feedback and say like, how do we improve? Can we afford 2 more cameras? Probably. I'm going to go ahead and say probably. Y'all can afford 2 more cameras to put on those players. So it isn't to disparage Eminence or Monarch or whoever else is putting on events. It's to say like, I think you guys could be putting on way better events that people get way more engaged in by doing this. And again, everybody benefits. It's going to be awesome. I want to watch Eminence events that are great. That would be better for me. I don't want to watch bad events or events that I don't like where I nitpick. That doesn't leave me feeling better where I'm just thinking like, man, I would have preferred this. Realistically, when events aren't good or ran well or interesting, I just tune out of it and it just doesn't add anything for me. Again, some of these might be logistical issues, but I think listening to this sort of feedback and saying like, is our casting really that good? Could we be doing these player camps? Could we be doing these interviews? Again, Eric mentioned how Pro Tours, things like that, they'll have on the floor interviews, which makes it feel like the players are actually at an event and they're not at a magical table that's floating in the middle of nowhere. You don't really get the feeling that they're at a convention hall in most cEDH coverage where there's lots of things happening and exciting, cool things happening beyond just what's happening on camera, and that you should show up to these events. All that you see is that one table with the floating hands coming back and forth out of frame. You don't really get the feeling that there's this big gathering of people having a ton of fun there, which is another thing without spending a lot of money that you get to just make your events look so much better and cooler and everything looks more professional.
This is no different than if I wrote a Google customer review. When you look at it from just a perspective of a customer review, I bought whatever the subscription so I could get like my ticket early because I really value the ability to go to these events. I really want to support anybody. Like, I don't care if it's Monarch, Eminence, whoever has the best product, I'll totally support. It could be Joe Blow down the street. They put on a great cEDH event, I'll go to it. I want to be a part of the growth of the community and what little way I can. I think I have a little bit more to offer to the community and a pretty unique perspective that's not just Magic related. That's what I want to do. I like working with people. Be open to feedback, which I'm not saying they're not, but I'm just stating this for the broader audience at large who's probably going to like crucify us for this one. Just understand that it's all coming from a positive perspective. Like if I didn't believe in like the products that we're talking about, I wouldn't be going to their event because I've only heard that the events are like a blast to be at, which that's awesome. And that's phenomenal. We're strictly talking about from a viewer's perspective on Twitch. That's it.
From what I can tell, everything about how the events are ran and what there is to do there and everything about going there seems great. Awesome. Sell me on it. Because I can't tell that from coverage. Doing something well and not highlighting it is just wasting effort on your own part. If you're not going to highlight the cool things that you are already doing, the good work you're already doing, then it's a bit of a waste of effort. And it's a shame because when I hear about an event super awesome like Punt City 2, and the only thing I can find on it is a table and 4 play mats and people going back and forth. Sure, there might have been exciting things that happened there, but it doesn't drive me to really show up and think it's going to be amazing based on the coverage that was presented to me.
Again, I would very much like to see like player profiles, following the story, following a narrative. I think that's fun because story is going to definitely drive content. And I think that's fascinating. And I think that gives you more material to work with your tournament coverage as well. Like, for example, if you didn't know anything about Punt City 1, you would be like, why do they keep calling this guy the mayor of Punt City?
Mhm.
You know, like, let's do like a nice little, like, in between segments, a little highlight profile, like cascading back and forth of Mike Sad, and then, you know, go from there. Brian Koval, no different than, you know, like, highlight your strengths. You know, if you've got some strong storylines there, you know, does the sassy Bryant Cook, who hasn't played a cEDH tournament in person, are they just going to come here? No, instead they had a great run and did really well. And they're one game away from top 4. That's great for the game.
One of the big things the Eminence is doing right now is also with their statistics and having like access to it in a database of all these statistics. That is a perfect thing to show on screen while nothing else is happening. If somebody there has stats at a previous tournament, pull it up. Pop it up, their win rate with the deck. I know we're still advancing with some statistic stuff. I'm hoping eventually we have stats on like cards and breakdowns like that. That would be phenomenal stuff to pull up on like the deck list that people brought, things like that. Those are already the strengths of Eminence that aren't being highlighted. And it's not even like adding a lot more workload. It's just adding implementation of it. Sometimes it's not throwing more man hours at it. It's just moving your work around to better highlight what is going to actually serve people better.
Yeah, especially too, if the whole point of this is to grow the community and highlight all these awesome things that people say about Commander cEDH specifically, then that's something we got to see. If it's something that's already in the works, awesome. Let's give us some tidbits, give us some breadcrumbs to follow if you're allowed to, you know, those type of things. It's one thing that I've always can't stand in any kind of industry I've ever worked for, been a part of, is non-transparency. Being transparent with your team or transparent with your audience in this case, it matters. And that gets into a whole nother subject that we're not covering today about transparency, but I'll let Matt handle that one.
You should probably stop trash talking your community and your fan base and your customers, you know, while you're at it.
To sum it up, highlight players, highlight decks, get the community to understand and follow through, make it exciting.
Magic set itself up to be able to create personalities. If Magic coverage was face down, you don't show the players, you don't do player profiles, it's just the board. Do figures like Brian Kibler, Reed Duke, do people like this emerge with like a following in a fan base? We think of those followings and fan bases around those people as like a major part of how Magic is in the Magic community. And I don't think those even exist if coverage for Grand Prix and Pro Tours was like how it is for cEDH events right now, because you just don't give people room to care about these figures.
Especially too when there's more people doing tournaments that aren't content creators, like the people who are actually playing these events. Now, some of them obviously are content creators, but not everybody.
Hopefully these didn't get you too upset. These are all ideally going to hopefully just improve the quality of the community. I think feedback is critical. I always ask for it. I want to make better things. I want to help others make better things. And then sometimes that means directly helping them out. Sometimes that just means pointing out things I think could be useful. So hopefully to some extent this is that. Thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, buy the shirts, go to Patreon, support over there. This has been Lemora's Cards, this time featuring Eric. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll check you next time.